In 1942, the United States government banned the private production of soap by homesteaders in several Western territories, not because it was dangerous, but because wartime industrial contracts had been awarded to companies like Procter & Gamble to supply the military, and small batch producers were cutting into that supply chain. That was the first time in American history that making something your grandmother did every Tuesday was considered an act of economic interference. Most people have no idea that happened. And most people have no idea just how many of the skills their great-grandparents used every single day have been quietly buried, not by time, not by progress, but by law, by lobbying, and by a culture that was deliberately trained to believe that if you can buy it at a store, you have no business knowing how to make it yourself. This video is about 25 of those skills, frontier-era survival knowledge, passed down through generations, that has nearly vanished from living memory. Before we get into the countdown, if this kind of history matters to you, subscribe. There are more of these stories to tell. Number 25. Reading weather through animal behavior. Before barometers became common household tools in the 1880s, frontier families watched their livestock. A horse that refused to drink from a creek before a storm, a dog that ate grass in the morning, chickens that refused to leave the coop. These were not superstitions. They were documented behavioral cues that farmers tracked in handwritten almanac journals. The technique was simple. Keep a daily log of animal behavior alongside weather outcomes for one full season. After that first year, the patterns revealed themselves. The reason this knowledge died is blunt. The National Weather Service, formalized through the Weather Bureau Act of 1890, gradually trained the public to trust centralized forecasting over personal observation. It was more efficient. It was also more dependent. Number 24. Making pine pitch glue. Across the Appalachians and the upper Midwest, families heated pine sap with powdered charcoal and beeswax in a 3:1 ratio, then poured it into molds to harden into waterproof adhesive sticks. This glue held together canoes, sealed roof joints, repaired cracked axe handles, and patched leather boots. It was heat-applied, meaning you warmed the stick near a flame and pressed it into the joint. The Ojibwe had been using variations of this recipe for centuries before European settlers adopted it. Industrial petroleum-based adhesives, pushed heavily by companies like H.B. Fuller after 1915, made this skill commercially obsolete within a generation. Number 23. Smoking meat without a smokehouse. Most people picture a dedicated timber structure when they think of meat smoking, but frontier families who were still clearing land used what is called a pit smoke, a 2-foot-deep hole in the ground, lined with green hardwood, covered with the meat on a rack, and blanketed with wet burlap or heavy canvas. The smoldering took 6 to 12 hours, depending on cut and thickness. The technique produced a cold smoke that preserved meat for up to 3 weeks without refrigeration. This method was common through the 1880s across Kansas, Nebraska, and Missouri territories. Modern USDA guidelines introduced in 1972 classify open-pit smoking as a non-compliant food preservation method for any commercially sold product, which effectively erased it from the public vocabulary. Number 22. Building a debris hut in under an hour. This is a skill your great-grandfather would have learned before he learned to ride a horse. A debris hut is an insulated shelter made from dry leaves, pine needles, bark, and thin branches stacked around a ridgepole. The rule was simple. The pile needed to be as tall as your hip and twice as wide as your body. That thickness of debris traps enough body heat to keep a person alive in temperatures down to 20 degrees Fahrenheit without a fire or blanket. 18th century frontier guides documented this specifically as a skill taught to children in Pennsylvania and Virginia settlements as young as 8 years old. It costs nothing. It requires nothing. No regulation killed it, only the assumption that you would never need it. Number 21. Reading the night sky for navigation without a compass. The North Star is obvious, but frontier navigators use the full sky. Orion's belt points true east when it rises and true west when it sets. The Big Dipper's outer 2 stars, called the pointer stars, draw a direct line to Polaris within 1 degree of true north. More practically, early American scouts in the 1700s learned to identify the exact position of the moon at different phases to estimate direction and time of night. This was taught as part of basic literacy in frontier communities. The Boy Scouts of America included it in their original 1911 handbook. It was quietly dropped from most curricula by the 1960s without explanation. Let that sit for a moment. A skill your grandfather was expected to know, that his grandfather taught him, that traces back to every indigenous nation on this continent, and it was considered optional knowledge by the time disco was invented. That is not progress. That is manufactured helplessness, and it did not happen by accident. When people know how to navigate, how to build, how to eat without a supply chain, they are harder to sell things to. Number 20. Identifying wild edibles by smell, not just sight. Visual identification of wild plants is taught in some foraging circles today, but smell-based identification was how frontier families confirmed what their eyes told them. Wild garlic smells unmistakably like garlic. Pennyroyal has a sharp mint smell that repels insects. Yarrow has a bitter, almost medicinal scent. The practice was to crush a small piece of leaf between two fingers before ever tasting. Settlers in New England documented this method extensively in household journals from the 1770s through the 1840s. Modern foraging guides rarely emphasize olfactory identification because it cannot be photographed for a book cover. Number 19. Making tallow candles using a dip rod. Store-bought paraffin candles were not widely available until the 1850s. Before that, families rendered animal fat, primarily beef tallow, in iron pots, then dipped twisted cotton wicks repeatedly into the liquid fat, letting each coat harden before re-dipping. A full candle required between 30 and 40 dips over the course of an afternoon. One frontier family in Vermont documented producing 60 candles in a single Saturday in 1831, enough to last a full winter. The candles burned cleanly for 3 to 4 hours each, and cost nothing beyond the fat from a slaughtered animal. Number 18. Setting a cold weather rabbit snare. This is a skill that existed across nearly every indigenous culture in North America, and was adopted wholesale by European settlers within one generation of contact. A simple loop of twisted plant fiber or thin copper wire, about 4 inches in diameter, placed 6 inches above the ground on a known rabbit run, could fill a family's protein needs through a hard winter. The technique required reading game trails from frost patterns in the early morning. Most states regulated or banned unattended wire snares for small game between 1950 and 1980, citing ecological concerns, some valid, some shaped by hunting industry lobbying that preferred licensed, equipment-dependent methods. Number 17. Using wood ash to make lye for cleaning. Before commercial soap and chemical cleaners, every family with a fireplace had access to one of the most effective cleaning agents ever used. Wood ash was packed into a barrel with a small hole drilled in the bottom. Water poured through the ash leached out potassium hydroxide lye, which dripped into a collection vessel below. That lye was then boiled with animal fat to make soap, or used directly to clean heavily soiled wool and linen. The process was so common that ash barrels were standard kitchen equipment in colonial America. The production and sale of lye was effectively nationalized through the 1970 Clean Air Act amendments, which classified uncontrolled lye production as a potential hazard. Home production for personal use remains legal in most states, though nobody tells you that. Number 16. Treating wounds with pine resin and plantain leaf. Before antibiotics, frontier families dealt with infected cuts using what was available. Common plantain, not the banana, the flat-leafed weed that grows in every cracked sidewalk in America, was bruised and pressed onto wounds as a drawing poultice. Combined with warm pine resin applied over the top as a sealant, this treatment was documented by military surgeons during the American Civil War as producing favorable outcomes for minor wound infections. The plantain draws, the resin seals, and both have documented antimicrobial properties confirmed by modern botanical research. No law prohibits this. We simply stopped teaching it. Number 15. Splitting firewood to the grain, not against it. The frontier settlers' rule was this: never swing an axe straight down. You read the grain of the wood, those subtle lines running along the log, and you split along them, not across them. A well-read grain split requires less than half the force of a blind chop. Men in the 1800s could split 4 cords of wood in a day, not because they were stronger than you, but because they understood the material. This knowledge is not regulated or illegal. It was never banned. It just died because chainsaws arrived, and effort was sold as the problem rather than the technique. Number 14. Reading soil to find water underground. Frontier families in the Great Plains identified underground water sources by reading vegetation patterns. Cottonwood trees in flat terrain almost always indicate water within 10 feet of the surface. Cattails mark standing or moving water. A line of unusually green grass cutting across dry terrain in late August usually traces a shallow aquifer below. This was practical knowledge documented in land survey reports from the 1870s across Kansas and Oklahoma territories. Modern land use regulations in several states now restrict private well drilling without permits. Reasonable in some cases, but a barrier in others. Number 13. Making a waterproof fire kit from natural materials. Your great-grandmother kept a fire kit that did not depend on matches. A piece of flint struck against high-carbon steel, not soft iron, but steel specifically, produces a spark hot enough to ignite charcloth. Small squares of cotton or linen charred inside a sealed tin until they are carbonized but intact. The charcloth catches the spark. The spark is transferred to a tinder bundle of dried grass or cattail fluff, and the bundle is blown into flame. The entire kit fits in a tin roughly the size of a deck of cards. American frontier guides of the 1700s required every man traveling west of the Allegheny Mountains to carry one. Number 12. Preserving eggs in water glass. Sodium silicate called water glass was used to preserve fresh eggs for up to 12 months without refrigeration. 1 part sodium silicate dissolved in 9 parts water, poured over fresh unwashed eggs in a ceramic crock, sealed the shell's pores and prevented bacterial penetration. Families in rural Ohio and Indiana in the early 1900s documented storing eggs from spring surplus through to winter using this method. The USDA does not approve water glass as a safe preservation method for eggs intended for sale. For personal use, it remains legal, and it still works. Number 11. Reading cloud formations for rain timing. Frontier families knew that a mackerel sky, those high-rippled altocumulus clouds, meant rain within 24 to 36 hours. A ring around the moon meant rain within 12. Anvil-shaped cumulonimbus clouds building to the southwest meant you had less than an hour. This was not folk superstition. These patterns are meteorologically accurate and are still used as baseline indicators in aviation weather training. The difference is your grandfather learned them from his father at age 9, sitting on a fence post watching the sky. You were told to check your phone. There is a reason these skills feel radical now. It is not because they are dangerous. It is not because they have been replaced by something better. It is because a culture of dependency is profitable in a way that a culture of competence is not. Every time you buy a candle instead of making one, a lighter instead of striking flint, a can of soup instead of a snare, someone is collecting on your not knowing. That is not an accident. That is an economy built on forgotten knowledge. Number 10. Making a friction fire using a bow drill. The bow drill method, a carved wooden spindle, rotated rapidly inside a notched fireboard using a strung bow, was used across every continent on Earth, and by virtually every pre-industrial culture in North America. The spindle must be dry, straight-grained softwood. The fireboard must be of similar or slightly softer wood. The notch beneath the spindle catches the friction dust, which forms a coal that is transferred to a tinder bundle. A practiced person can produce fire in under 2 minutes. The method requires no purchased materials. It requires only knowledge and practice. Number 9. Curing leather with brains. Every animal, the old saying went, has exactly enough brains to tan its own hide. Brain tanning, rubbing an emulsified mixture of cooked brain matter into a dehaired hide, then smoking it to set the oils, produces the softest, most water-resistant leather ever made, far superior to vegetable-tanned leather for working clothes and moccasins. The technique was used by indigenous peoples across the continent and adopted by frontier settlers throughout the 1700s and 1800s. There is no regulation preventing it at home. The commercial tanning industry, dominated by chemical chrome tanning processes, introduced in the 1880s, simply made it economically irrelevant. Number 8. Making a clay pot that holds water. Frontier settlers who lost their equipment to a river crossing or a fire knew how to identify workable clay, usually found in creek banks with a grayish-blue or reddish tint. Mix it with fine sand or crushed dried grass to prevent cracking. Shape it by hand, dry it slowly over several days, and fire it in a simple pit kiln using hardwood coals. A hand-built clay vessel can hold water within 48 hours of starting from raw earth. This was a last resort skill, documented in journals from the Oregon Trail migration period of the 1840s and 50s. Number 7. Reading a tree stump to understand climate history. Before your great-great-grandparents cleared a stand of timber, they read the stumps. Wide rings meant wet years. Narrow rings meant drought. A cluster of very narrow rings could indicate a hard stretch of 3 or 4 consecutive dry summers, meaning the land itself was telling you what to expect and when to plant, and when to store extra. Foresters still use this method, called dendrochronology, in scientific research. It was once common agricultural knowledge available to anyone with an axe and a stump. Number 6. Making charcoal for water filtration. Wood charcoal, not commercial activated charcoal, but simple hardwood charcoal produced in a smothered fire, was used by frontier families to filter murky water by packing it between layers of sand and gravel inside a hollowed log or clay vessel. It does not sterilize water from biological pathogens the way boiling does, but it removes sediment, odor, and many heavy metals effectively. This was documented in military field manuals as late as World War I. The technique is legal, free, and almost nobody under 40 has ever been taught it. Number 5. Reading which direction you are facing by the moss rule, and knowing when it lies. The saying is that moss grows on the north side of trees, and in open forests with consistent light patterns, it often does. But frontier navigators knew the exceptions. In dense canopy, moss grows wherever moisture collects, not just on the north. The real skill was knowing that the rule is a starting point, not a law. You confirmed it by checking 3 or 4 trees in a row and finding the consistent pattern. 1 tree tells you nothing, 4 trees in agreement tells you your direction within about 15 degrees. Number 4. Preserving root vegetables in a sand pack. Carrots, parsnips, beets, and turnips pulled in late October could be stored through March by packing them in alternating layers with slightly damp, not wet sand inside a wooden barrel kept in a root cellar or dug into a hillside. The sand regulated humidity, prevented the vegetables from touching and rotting each other, and maintained a consistent 40 to 50 degree temperature environment. Families in the mid-Atlantic colonies documented storing enough root vegetables to feed a family of 6 through an entire winter this way. By the early 1700s. Number 3. Making a medicinal poultice from black walnut hulls. The green outer hull of the black walnut, not the hard shell inside, but the soft green outer layer, contains juglone, a compound with documented antifungal and antibacterial properties. Frontier families mashed the fresh green hull and applied it directly to skin infections, ringworm, and infected wounds. It stains the skin deep brown, but it worked. This was documented in Appalachian folk medicine records from the 1820s through the early 1900s. No law prevents this. It simply requires a black walnut tree and the knowledge that the green hull is the part that matters. Number 2. Identifying the time of night by star position. The Big Dipper rotates completely around Polaris every 24 hours, or rather the Earth turns beneath it. Frontier navigators learned that the Dipper's position relative to north at any given season could tell you the hour within about 30 minutes of accuracy. By memorizing the Dipper's 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 9 o'clock positions for a given season, you had a star clock that required no batteries and never ran slow. This was taught to children in frontier communities as basic survival literacy. It is still accurate. It still works tonight. And number 1. Starting a fire in wet conditions using fatwood. Fatwood is the resin-saturated heartwood found at the base of dead pine stumps, not fresh-cut pine, but old stumps where the resin has concentrated over years as the sapwood rotted away. Frontier families knew exactly where to look for it and kept a supply of it through winter the way you keep a lighter in your kitchen drawer. A sliver of fatwood will catch a spark in rain, in wind, in conditions where every other tinder fails. Because the resin content is so high, it burns almost like a candle. A single pine stump that has been dead for 5 years or more will typically yield enough fatwood in its core to light 100 fires. These 25 skills are not relics. They are not curiosities. They are the living memory of people who understood something that our current culture has deliberately obscured, that the line between you and starvation, between you and hypothermia, between you and complete dependence on systems you did not build and cannot control, is exactly as thin as the knowledge you carry in your own head. Your great-grandparents did not feel proud of these skills. They felt normal. This was just life.